At 3:47 a.m. on November 12, 1944, Private First Class Ramon Delgado Cruz crouched in a moss-covered foxhole 30 meters from the Abucay Samal Trail junction, watching 17 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers approach through morning fog so thick it hung like wet cotton between the mahogany trees. His right hand rested on a vine no thicker than fishing line, connected to a network of improvised tripwires he'd woven through the jungle canopy, using nothing but local rattan, repurposed telegraph wire, and emptied American ration cans filled with pebbles and spent rifle casings. The nearest guerrilla reinforcement position stood 840 meters west across the Talisay River, a little far to reach before the Japanese patrol would overrun his observation post and discover the supply cache hidden in the limestone cave system behind him. In approximately 90 seconds, the lead scout would trigger the first wire, and the next 4 minutes would either validate 3 months of dismissed field reports or confirm every headquarters officer's assessment that Cruz was wasting valuable materiel on primitive superstition. This is the story of how an uneducated coconut farmer with no formal military training created a defensive system so devastatingly effective that Japanese intelligence files would later classify entire grid squares as cruise zones, areas to be avoided at all costs. The jungle was holding its breath. Cruz could hear them now, not their footsteps, which were professionally silent, but the small environmental disturbances their movement created. A bamboo rat that stopped chittering, a fruit bat that altered its flight path, the subtle change in how water dripped from broad leaves when human bodies displaced air underneath them. These were the sounds that didn't belong, the auditory negative space that revealed more than any noise could. He'd been in this exact position for 6 hours, completely motionless, except for the slow, controlled breathing he'd learned from watching monitor lizards in the midday heat. His legs had gone numb below the knees 2 hours ago. His bladder screamed for relief. But Cruz didn't move, because movement meant death, and death meant the 17,000 pounds of captured Japanese ammunition, medical supplies, and rice in the cave complex would fall back into enemy hands. Supplies that could sustain his entire guerrilla battalion for 4 months. The lead Japanese scout was 20 meters out now, moving with the careful precision of a man who knew he was in guerrilla country. Cruz could just barely make out his silhouette through the pre-dawn darkness and fog. A slim figure, rifle held at low ready, head turning in careful arcs as he scanned the jungle floor. Behind him, the patrol moved in a staggered column, maintaining proper spacing, weapons discipline evident even in this terrain that should have made them careless. These weren't the green Kishtkripes or Korean laborers that sometimes patrolled the coastal roads. These were Kempe-Tai field operatives and veteran infantrymen from the 16th Division, and hardened fighters who'd survived 3 years of brutal jungle warfare across the Pacific. They'd come for the cash, which meant someone had talked, or their intelligence network had finally pieced together the supply movement patterns. Either way, they were hunting, and they expected resistance. What they didn't expect was what Cruz had built. 3 months earlier, every officer in the Luzon guerrilla network had dismissed his proposal as the desperate fantasy of an ignorant farmer playing soldier. Tripwires are basic field craft, they'd said. The Japanese sweep for them. They're trained to spot them. You're wasting time and materiel on something that might catch one careless soldier, if you're lucky. The American liaison officer, Captain James Bradley, had been more direct. Private Cruz, We appreciate your enthusiasm. But this isn't coconut farming. Modern infantry doesn't fall for primitive traps. Stick to observation and reporting. But Cruz hadn't been proposing basic tripwires. He'd been proposing something the Japanese had never encountered. Something that combined pre-colonial hunting techniques with modern guerrilla adaptation. Something that turned the jungle itself into an intelligent, responsive weapon system. And in approximately 60 seconds, he was going to prove everyone wrong. Ramon Delgado Cruz was born in 1919 in the village of Dinalupihan, Bataan Province, the third son of a family that had farmed the same 20 hectares of coconut groves for 6 generations. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 128 pounds when well fed, and had never attended a single day of formal school in his life. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. And he could barely speak Tagalog outside his local Kapampangan dialect, and his English consisted of exactly 11 words, most of them military ranks he'd learned since joining the guerrillas. What Cruz could do was read the jungle. He'd spent 34 years living in, working in, and surviving in the dense tropical forests of Bataan. He knew which vines grew fastest, which could bear weight, which attracted specific insects, and which could be harvested without killing the parent plant. He knew bird behavior, animal patterns, seasonal water flow, and the exoacoustic properties of different tree hollows. He understood the jungle as a living system, not a static terrain feature. Before the war, he'd been utterly unremarkable, one of thousands of subsistence farmers who worked dawn to dusk, sold copra at market, and rarely traveled more than 20 kilometers from their birthplace. When the Japanese invaded in December 1941, Cruz had initially hidden in the mountains with his family like everyone else. When his village was burned in a reprisal raid in March 1942, he'd joined the guerrillas not out of patriotic fervor, but because they were the only organization offering food and some semblance of security. The guerrilla recruiters had taken one look at him, illiterate, undersized, no military experience, no education, no useful skills beyond agricultural labor, and assigned him to observation duties. You watch the trails, they'd told him. You count Japanese patrols. You report back. Don't engage. Don't try to be a hero. Just watch and count. Cruz had done exactly that for 14 months. He'd watched trails, counted patrols, and then reported back with the mechanical reliability of a man who understood that his value to the organization was purely functional. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter. He was a pair of eyes in the jungle, nothing more. But while he watched, he noticed things. He noticed that Japanese patrols moved through the jungle with excellent tactical discipline, but terrible environmental awareness. They were trained for combat, for ambushes, for enemy contact, but not for the jungle itself. They watched for human threats while ignoring the forest's own warning systems. They swept for obvious tripwires, but never looked up at canopy connections. They moved through terrain features without understanding how those features could be weaponized beyond simple ambush positions. Most critically, Cruz noticed that the Japanese had systematized their counter-guerrilla operations to the point of predictability. They used the same patrol intervals, the same spacing, the same sweep patterns, the same security halts. Their training manuals had created consistency, and consistency created exploitable patterns. In August 1943, Cruz began experimenting, using materials he could gather without leaving his observation posts: rattan vines, wild palm fiber, scavenged wire from destroyed telegraph lines, emptied food tins from American supply drops. He started building what he thought of simply as improvements to his hide positions. Not tripwires in the conventional military sense, but something more comprehensive. An early warning system that would tell him patrol, compositions, movement speeds, and an approach vectors without requiring visual confirmation. His first attempt was laughably simple. A single rattan vine stretched across a game trail at ankle height, connected to a suspended tin can filled with pebbles. When a Japanese patrol triggered it during a routine sweep, the Soys sent crews scrambling deeper into the jungle before they could locate his position. But the patrol had stopped, investigated, and then moved on, categorizing it as either an animal snare or natural vine growth. That taught crews something crucial. The Japans expected military tripwires, wire stretched tight, connected to grenades or flares, obvious in their artificiality. They didn't expect organic materials that looked like natural jungle growth. They didn't expect audio signals instead of explosive ones. And they didn't expect systems designed purely for information gathering rather than direct engagement. Over the next 3 months, Cruz refined his approach. He learned that rattan vines, when properly treated and positioned, were nearly invisible in jungle undergrowth and could last weeks without rotting. He discovered that different vine thicknesses responded to different weight pressures, meaning he could create a graduated system that distinguished between individual soldiers, small patrols, and large formations. He found that suspended noisemakers, cans filled with stones, bamboo sections with pebbles, even clusters of dried seed pods, provided directional audio information if positioned correctly. By November 1943, Sears had transformed his observation post into something that would have baffled military engineers. A 200-meter radius early warning network that told him not just that someone was coming, but exactly how many, from which direction, at what speed, and with what level of caution. He reported this capability to his guerrilla cell leader, Sergeant Vicente Madrigal, who reported it up the chain to the battalion intelligence officer, Lieutenant Rodrigo Santos, who reported it to the American liaison staff. The response was consistent at every level. Polite skepticism. Private Cruz has developed some rudimentary tripwire systems around his observation post, Lieutenant Santos wrote in his January 1944 field report. While showing commendable initiative, these appear to be standard hunter's snares adapted for military purposes. Just their utility is limited to basic early warning. Cruz claims he can determine patrol composition and strength from sound patterns alone, which seems unlikely given his lack of technical training. Recommend continuing his observation duties, but declining his request for additional wire and materiel to expand the system. The American liaison officer, Captain Bradley, was more direct in his assessment during a February 1944 command briefing. "We've got a coconut farmer who thinks he's invented something revolutionary with vines and tin cans. He's enthusiastic, and enthusiasm is valuable. But let's not confuse field improvisation with tactical innovation. The Japanese are professional soldiers with years of jungle experience. Yet they're not going to be stymied by snare traps." What none of these officers understood, what they couldn't understand without Cruz's specific environmental knowledge, was that he wasn't trying to stop Japanese patrols. He was trying to read them. In guerrilla warfare, information was more valuable than engagement. Knowing exactly when a patrol was coming, in what strength, with what equipment, moving at what speed. That information allowed guerrilla units to avoid contact when advantageous, set ambushes when possible, and protect supply caches when necessary. Cruz's system didn't need to kill Japanese soldiers. It needed to make them visible, audible, and predictable. By March 1944, Cruz had expanded his network to cover 4 major trail junctions around the Abuque sector, and all connected to a central observation post he'd dug into a limestone outcropping overlooking the coastal approach. His system now incorporated over 300 individual tripwires, 17 distinct noise-making stations, and a crude but effective mapping technique using knotted rope to indicate wire positions, since he couldn't write or read maps. The guerrilla commanders humored him largely because his observation reports were consistently accurate, and his material requests were minimal, mostly scavenged goods that cost the organization nothing. If the weird coconut farmer wanted to spend his time weaving elaborate vine networks, that was fine, as long as he kept providing good intelligence. Then in April 1944, Cruz did something that should have changed everything. The Japanese patrol triggered his outer perimeter wires while approaching the Samal village supply route. Based purely on the audio signature, the pattern of rattling cans, the sequence of triggered wires, the timing between activations, Cruz reported to headquarters that he'd detected 11 enemy soldiers moving in column formation, carrying heavy equipment, moving cautiously with scouts forward and rear security, approximately 45 minutes from reaching the village. The guerrilla unit shadowing that route confirmed every detail. 11 soldiers, heavy machine gun team, textbook patrol formation, arrived at the village exactly 43 minutes after Cruz's report. Lieutenant Santos was impressed enough to include it in his intelligence summary. Cruz's tripwire network successfully detected and characterized patrol composition with unusual accuracy. While likely partially fortunate, this demonstrates potential value of enhanced observation post-preparation. Captain Bradley's response was more measured. One successful prediction doesn't validate the entire system. We need to see consistent results over time, and we need to understand whether Cruz is actually reading his tripwires or just making educated guesses based on standard Japanese patrol patterns. Recommend continued monitoring but no additional resource allocation. Cruz didn't get approval to expand his system or receive the additional wire and materials he'd requested. But he didn't need approval. He had the jungle, and the jungle provided everything he needed. Over the next 6 months, Cruz quietly expanded his network to cover 12 trail systems, using materials he gathered himself during his observation rotations. He refined his audio signatures, learning to distinguish between different types of Japanese units based on how they moved through his wire fields. Regular infantry triggered wires in predictable patterns. Scout, main body, rear security, evenly spaced. Kempeitai patrols moved more cautiously, with irregular spacing and frequent security halts. Supply columns moved slowly, triggering wires in sequence as laden soldiers struggled through difficult terrain. By October 1944, Cruz could sit in his central observation post and, by listening to the pattern of rattling cans and rustling wires, he'd tell you exactly what was moving through the jungle around him without seeing a single enemy soldier. The guerrilla intelligence network began to rely on his reports, even as they dismissed the methodology behind them. Cruz says large patrol heading northeast on Trail 7 became shorthand for reliable intelligence, even if nobody quite understood how an illiterate farmer was obtaining that intelligence. The officers still thought of it as lucky guesses and good instincts. The American liaison still considered it primitive fieldcraft that happened to work sometimes. Nobody thought of it as a defensive weapon system because Cruz himself had never presented it that way. Until November 10th, 1944, when everything changed. In early November 1944, Just a guerrilla intelligence intercepted a Japanese supply convoy moving through the mountain passes east of Manila. The convoy was vulnerable. Undermanned escort, poor road conditions, limited air support, and the guerrilla command decided to risk a rare daylight raid. The raid succeeded beyond all expectations. The guerrillas captured 3 trucks containing ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment, and perhaps most valuable of all, 17,000 pounds of rice, enough to feed the entire Bataan guerrilla network for months. It was the single largest supply capture in Luzon guerrilla history, and it immediately created an enormous problem. The captured material was too large to move quickly and too valuable to abandon. The Japanese would search for it systematically, throwing every available unit into the hunt, and the guerrillas needed a hiding place that could hold tons of supplies while remaining concealed from aggressive enemy search operations. Lieutenant Santos proposed the Abuque Cave system, a network of limestone caverns in the coastal mountains that were accessible by footpath but invisible from the air and difficult to approach without local knowledge. The caves were deep, dry, and defensible. More importantly, they sat directly in the center of Ramon Cruz's observation sector. Cruz knows every trail approach to those caves, Santos argued during the command briefing. He's been watching that sector for 2 years. If the Japanese come looking, he'll see them first. Captain Bradley agreed, with reservations. The caves are a good location, but we're trusting a lot to one observation post. And if Cruz misses a Japanese patrol or miscalculates their approach, we lose everything. We should position a full platoon around the cache for security. We don't have a full platoon to spare, Colonel Reyes, the guerrilla battalion commander, pointed out. Every unit we have is committed to raids, security, or civilian protection. Cruz has been reliable. His sector hasn't been compromised in 2 years. We put the cache in the caves, we put Cruz on observation, and we keep mobile units ready to respond if he reports enemy contact. It was a calculated risk, based on resource scarcity, not confidence in Cruz's capabilities. But it was the decision that got made. On November 6th, guerrilla porters hauled the captured supplies into the Abuque caves under cover of darkness. Cruz watched from his observation post as they worked. Yet noting the trails they used, the timing of their movements, and the physical evidence they inevitably left behind: disturbed vegetation, compressed soil, broken branches. When the last porter left just before dawn on November 7th, Cruz went to work. He spent 4 days doing something that would have seemed insane to any conventionally trained soldier. He made the trails leading to the cave more obvious, not less. He enhanced the evidence of recent activity instead of concealing it. He created what looked like hastily disguised approaches, complete with poorly hidden footprints and carelessly broken foliage. And then, around each of these obvious approaches, he wove the most complex tripwire network he'd ever constructed. Cruz wasn't trying to hide the cache. He was creating a puzzle box. He was designing the trails to look like they'd been used by guerrillas trying to hide their movements. But he was making the hidden approaches visible enough that Japanese scouts would find them. And when they found them, they'd move down those trails with the confidence of hunters who'd discovered their prey's den, right into the killing zone his tripwires had created. But Cruz didn't tell anyone about this plan. He couldn't have explained it if he'd tried. He didn't think in terms of tactical doctrine or psychological operations. He thought in terms of how the jungle worked, how animals moved through it, how predators hunted, and how prey survived. He was creating what hunters in his village called a false warren, A trail that looked like it led somewhere important, but actually led into a trap. On November 10th, our cruise's perimeter wires detected heavy Japanese movement on 3 approach routes simultaneously. Based on the audio signatures, he estimated 40 to 50 soldiers moving in coordinated sweeps, searching systematically, moving with the patient aggression of troops who knew their target was nearby. He sent a runner to guerrilla headquarters with a simple message: Japanese searching, many soldiers. Will report when they find trails. Lieutenant Santos received the report at 14:30 hours and immediately dispatched a reaction force to prepare for possible evacuation of the cache. The force consisted of 23 guerrillas armed with a mix of captured Japanese rifles, old American Springfields, and civilian hunting weapons, barely enough to fight a delaying action. That's completely insufficient to defend the cache against a determined Japanese assault. If Cruz reports they've found the cave approaches, we abandon the cache and pull back, Santos told his unit commanders. We can't hold it, and we can't afford to lose men defending it. Material can be replaced. Men can't. Captain Bradley agreed. The moment Cruz says they're on the cave trails, we collapse the operation and disperse. We knew this was a risk. Sometimes, in guerrilla operations, you lose the prize. But Cruz never sent that report, because on November 11th at approximately 16:15 hours, the Japanese patrols found the obvious trails leading toward the caves, exactly as Cruz had designed them to, and they began their approach with the confidence of soldiers who believed they'd outmaneuvered their enemy. And Cruz's tripwires went to work. Japanese intelligence had correctly identified the general area of the cache by November 10th through a combination of informant reports, aerial observation of unusual guerrilla activity, and systematic elimination of possible hiding locations. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto, commanding the 16th Division's Special Security Detachment, had assembled 53 soldiers for the operation. 2 full platoons of veteran infantry, a Kempeitai field intelligence team, and specialized mountain warfare troops who'd spent 2 years hunting guerrillas in similar terrain. Yamamoto was nobody's fool. He'd survived 3 years of Pacific combat by never underestimating his enemy and never rushing into terrain that favored defenders. His tactical approach was methodical: multiple approach routes, coordinated sweep patterns, regular communication checks, overlapping fields of fire. His operational plan called for simultaneous sweeps along 4 major trails leading into the mountain zone where the caves were suspected to be located. Each sweep team would advance cautiously, watching for ambushes, checking for tripwires, maintaining discipline. When they located the cache, they'd establish a perimeter, call for reinforcements, and conduct a deliberate assault with overwhelming force. It was a textbook operation planned by a competent officer using experienced troops. It should have worked. On November 11th, at 16:25 hours, Lieutenant Kenji Sato's team found what they were looking for on the northern approach trail: fresh footprints, broken vegetation, signs of recent heavy load-bearing traffic, leading up a narrow mountain path toward a limestone outcropping. Sato reported to Yamamoto. Northern trail shows recent activity, multiple personnel, heavy loads, movement toward high ground. Proceeding with caution. Yamamoto's response was immediate. Confirmed. Maintain radio silence except position reports. Watch for ambush. Advance with scouts forward. What neither officer knew was that Cruz had heard Sato's team enter his wire network 17 minutes earlier. The pattern of triggered wires told him everything. 12 soldiers moving in tactical column, weapons at ready, scouts forward, moving carefully, but with purpose. They'd found the obvious trail. They were taking the bait. Cruz didn't alert headquarters. He didn't call for the reaction force. He simply settled deeper into his observation post, checked the positioning of his crude rope map in the darkness and waited. At 16:43 hours, Sato's lead scout triggered the first real tripwire. Not an audio detector, but an actual trap. The wire itself was invisible. A strand of rattan vine, no thicker than thread, positioned 12 centimeters above the ground and painted with mud to match the forest floor. It stretched across the trail at precisely the point where the path narrowed between two large rocks, where soldiers would naturally compress their formation and focus their attention on the constriction point ahead rather than the ground at their feet. When the scout's boot caught the wire, it pulled a trigger mechanism Cruz had designed over 30 iterations. A bent sapling branch held under tension by the tripwire connected to a suspended cluster of 9 emptied ration cans filled with stones and rusted metal fragments. Some the cans dropped from the canopy directly behind the patrol column with a sound like a landslide, a massive, percussive crash that shattered the jungle silence and sent every Japanese soldier diving for cover with weapons raised. For exactly 4 seconds, there was chaos. Soldiers shouting, weapons tracking toward the sound, officers demanding situation reports, the entire patrol formation collapsing as men sought cover from what sounded like an incoming artillery barrage. Then silence. No explosion. No gunfire. No enemy contact. Just jungle sounds slowly resuming, and a cluster of tin cans hanging from a tree branch, still swaying slightly. Sato moved forward to investigate, his frustration evident even in his whispered radio report. False alarm, primitive noise trap, continuing advance. Yamamoto's response was sharp. Noted. Maintain caution. They know we're here. But that wasn't the trap. The noise was just Cruz, announcing to the Japanese that he knew they were on the trail. The real trap was what happened next. Because while the Japanese patrol had been focused on the crashing cans behind them, they'd failed to notice that 3 more soldiers had triggered 3 more tripwires, silent ones this time, designed not to make noise, but to release carefully positioned natural obstacles. Cruz had spent weeks preparing this section of trail. He'd identified 3 large dead branches in the canopy above the path, each weighing 40 to 60 pounds, each positioned to create maximum obstruction when released. The tripwires that released them were set at varying heights, ankle level, knee level, and waist level, ensuring that soldiers moving at different heights and postures would trigger them, regardless of their tactical spacing. When the first branch fell, it crashed across the trail directly in front of the main patrol body, forcing an immediate halt. The second branch fell 6 meters ahead of the scouts, blocking forward movement. The third fell behind the rear security element, cutting off retreat. Within 15 seconds, Sato's 12-man patrol found themselves boxed in on a narrow mountain trail, surrounded by thick jungle, with obvious obstacles front and rear that would require time and noise to clear. They were channeled, contained, and completely exposed. Sato recognized the tactical problem immediately. We're boxed in, obstacles front and rear, narrow trail, limited movement, possible ambush position. But there was no ambush. No gunfire erupted from the jungle. No grenades came arcing through the darkness. The forest remained silent except for the normal sounds of evening insects and distant birds. After 5 minutes of tense waiting, Sato made the logical decision. Begin clearing obstacles. Maintain security. His men moved forward to remove the fallen branches, weapons shouldered, movements careful, but necessarily focused on the physical labor of clearing heavy wood from the narrow trail. And that's when the third layer of Cruz's trap activated. The fallen branches weren't just obstacles. They were trigger points. When the Japanese soldiers grabbed the first branch to move it, they pulled it against 3 more hidden tripwires positioned underneath it. Wires that released a cascade of consequences crews had engineered with the patience of a farmer, who understood that complex systems required multiple redundancies. First, more noise. A dozen suspended cans dropped from various positions around the clearing, creating multiple sound sources that split the patrol's attention in 6 different directions. Second, disorientation. Clusters of dried palm fronds, held in the canopy by tension wires, dropped directly onto the trail, creating visual obstruction and forcing soldiers to move through hanging debris. Third, communication disruption. One of the falling can clusters struck Sato's radio operator squarely on the shoulders. Now, not hard enough to injure, but violent enough to make him drop his radio equipment into the mud, severing the patrol's communication with headquarters. Fourth, and most devastating, a chain reaction. Crews had connected the tripwires under the first branch to the tripwires under the second branch, 60 meters up the trail. When the Japanese soldiers at the rear of the patrol moved to clear their obstacle, they simultaneously triggered the traps at the front of the patrol, creating confusion about the direction and source of the disturbances. Within 90 seconds, Sato's patrol had transformed from a tactical unit into a disorganized cluster of soldiers trying to understand what was happening, where it was coming from, and whether they were under actual attack. The answer to the last question was no. Crews still hadn't fired a single shot. Yeah, but the Japanese didn't know that. All they knew was that their carefully planned advance had devolved into chaos created by an enemy they couldn't see using weapons they didn't understand. At 17:04 hours, Sato's radio operator finally re-established contact with Yamamoto and reported the situation. Multiple trap activations, no enemy contact, trail obstructed. Unable to advance without extensive clearing operations. Request orders. Yamamoto's response revealed his growing concern. Hold position. Other teams reporting similar obstacles and traps on their approach routes. Establishing whether this is defense in depth or diversion. Because while Sato's team had been struggling with Cruz's first trap line, now the other 3 Japanese approach teams had encountered their own versions of the same system. Each one adapted to the specific terrain of their trail, each one creating confusion and delay without direct combat. The Japanese were being bled by attrition of morale and time, not casualties. By 1800 hours, as darkness fell completely, all 4 Japanese approach teams had halted their advances. They'd encountered dozens of tripwires, noise traps, obstacles, and diversions. They'd expended enormous effort clearing paths, maintaining security, and trying to determine if they were approaching a heavily defended position or being toyed with by a single guerrilla with too much time and too many tin cans. Yamamoto made the tactically sound decision. All teams withdraw to assembly areas. Establish security perimeter. They will resume operations at first light with engineer support to systematically clear the approaches. It was the right call. Night operations in jungle terrain filled with booby traps would have been suicidal. Better to consolidate, rest, and approach the problem with fresh troops and specialized equipment in the morning. But withdrawing created its own problems, because Cruz's tripwires worked just as well in reverse. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive movement during advances and careful, security-focused movement during withdrawals. Sato's team executed their retreat exactly by the manual. Rear security became point element. Main body moved in reverse order. Weapons oriented outward. Maximum alertness maintained. They moved down the same trail they'd ascended, and expecting to encounter the same obstacles they'd already cleared. What they found instead was that the obstacles had been replaced. The fallen branches they'd moved off the trail were back in position, as if they'd never been cleared. The tripwires they'd carefully cut were reconnected. The moist traps they'd disabled were reset and armed. It was impossible. They'd only been on the upper trail for 90 minutes. No guerrilla force could have infiltrated behind them, reset elaborate trap systems, and disappeared without detection, not while Japanese soldiers maintained rear security throughout the advance. Except Cruz hadn't infiltrated behind them. He'd never left his observation post 200 meters away. Yet the reset traps weren't reset at all. They were new traps he'd activated remotely, using a system of pulleys and counterweights he'd built into the trail network over the previous 4 days. Cruz had designed the entire system with a simple principle. The Japanese would advance carefully the first time, but they'd move faster on the return trip, assuming they'd already cleared the threats. That overconfidence would make them vulnerable to a second layer of traps positioned to exploit their familiarity with the trail. At 18:27 hours, Sato's scout triggered the first new tripwire, a knee-height rattan strand connected to what Cruz called his voice trap. Inside a hollow tree trunk 3 meters from the trail, Cruz had positioned a bamboo section sealed at both ends and filled with dry rice, husks, pebbles, and a live beetle species that made a loud clicking sound when disturbed. The tripwire pulled a release cord that dumped the contents of the bamboo tube into a metal cooking pot salvaged from a destroyed village. The resulting sound was visceral and immediate, a sudden, loud, rattling, clicking, scraping noise that sounded exactly like someone working a rifle bolt at close range. The Japanese patrol's response was instinctive and immediate. Every soldier dropped to combat positions, weapons oriented toward the sound, fingers on triggers, adrenaline spiking. 3 seconds of absolute tension. Then recognition. Another noise trap. Another primitive diversion. But those 3 seconds had consequences. Because while the lead soldiers focused on the sound ahead, and the rear security element kept moving, and walked directly into a vine net Cruz had positioned at neck height, suspended between trees, designed to catch on helmets and equipment. 2 soldiers became entangled simultaneously, their startled shouts adding to the chaos. Their weapons temporarily trapped in the netting as they struggled to free themselves. The patrol halted again. Security collapsed again. Discipline held, but barely. Sato's frustration was evident in his radio report. Encountering persistent harassment tactics, multiple non-lethal traps, no enemy contact, trail conditions worse than advance, estimate 30 minutes to clear our route back to assembly point. Yamamoto's response was terse. Expedite withdrawal. All teams report similar harassment. You break contact and return to base with maximum speed, consistent with security. But maximum speed was exactly what Cruz's trap system was designed to prevent. Over the next 40 minutes, Sato's patrol encountered 17 more tripwires, each one triggering a different harassment mechanism. Noise, obstacles, hanging debris, false movement sounds, even one trap that released a cloud of disturbed insects from a rotted tree trunk. Cruz hadn't planned that one specifically, but he'd noticed the hornet's nest during his trail preparation and incorporated it into his wire network anyway. None of the traps caused serious injury. None created actual tactical threats, but each one demanded time, attention, and emotional energy. Each one eroded discipline by increments. each one transformed professional soldiers into exhausted and frustrated men who'd spent 3 hours fighting an enemy that didn't exist while achieving absolutely nothing. By the time Sato's team finally reached their assembly area at 1911 hours, they'd traveled less than 800 meters and expended more energy than a 5-kilometer combat patrol. The other 3 approach teams reported similar experiences: constant harassment, 0 enemy contact, massive time consumption, and growing uncertainty about whether they were facing a sophisticated defense system or an elaborate bluff. Captain Yamamoto faced an operational dilemma. His orders were clear: locate and secure the guerrilla supply cache. His intelligence was solid. The PA was in these mountains, near the cave systems, accessible by these specific trails, yet his forces were adequate. 53 trained soldiers against guerrilla forces that rarely fielded more than 20 or 30 fighters in any single engagement. But his tactical situation was degrading. His troops were frustrated, exhausted, and mentally off balance. His approach routes were demonstrably compromised by an enemy who could harass his movements with apparent impunity. His timetable was slipping. What should have been a one-day operation was now extending into multiple days. At 1945 hours, Yamamoto made his second major decision. All teams will establish defensive perimeters at current positions: hot meal, rest rotation, full security. Tomorrow we bring in engineers with mine-clearing equipment and conduct systematic advance with explosive trap clearance. Now we'll treat this as a mined defensive position and proceed accordingly. It was, again, the tactically correct decision. Engineers could clear tripwires faster than infantry. Systematic approaches with dedicated clearing teams would negate the harassment tactics. Treating the area as a prepared defensive position would prevent casualties from overconfidence. But it required calling in additional forces, extending the operation timeline, and broadcasting to the entire Japanese command structure that a single guerrilla position had stalled a veteran combat unit for an entire day. And it gave Cruz exactly what he'd been fighting for: time. While the Japanese consolidated their positions for the night, Cruz sent runners to guerrilla headquarters with detailed reports that should have been impossible for a single observer to compile. And he reported the exact composition of each Japanese approach team: 12 soldiers on Northern Trail, 14 on Eastern Trail, 11 on Southern Trail, 16 on Western Trail. He reported their weapons: primarily Type 38 rifles, 2 Type 96 light machine guns, officer sidearms, grenades. He reported their tactical approach: coordinated advances, professional discipline, systematic clearing of obstacles. Most impressively, he reported their current emotional state: frustrated, cautious, exhausted, uncertain about the threat they were facing. "How the hell does he know any of this?" Captain Bradley asked when Lieutenant Santos delivered Cruz's report to the guerrilla command post at 20:30 hours. "He's one man in one observation post, and he can't possibly have eyes on 4 separate Japanese positions simultaneously." Santos spread out the hand-drawn map Cruz had sent with his runner. A crude diagram showing trail positions, wire locations, and enemy unit positions marked with knotted string and simple symbols. "He's not using eyes, sir. He's using his tripwire network. Each wire tells him something when it's triggered: weight, direction, speed, spacing. He's reading the Japanese movements like someone else would read a written report." "That's not possible," Bradley insisted. "You can't extract that level of detailed intelligence from noise traps and vine tripwires." He's guessing, or he's got spotters we don't know about, or he's getting lucky. Probably all three. Colonel Reyes, who'd been listening quietly, interrupted. Lucky for 18 months? Every report Cruz has filed has been accurate. Every patrol count, every composition estimate, every movement prediction. Either he's the luckiest guesser in military history, or he's actually doing what he claims he's doing. Which is what exactly? Bradley asked. Reading minds through jungle vines? Reading patterns, Reyes corrected. The Japanese move through his sector with predictable patterns because they're well-trained soldiers following tactical doctrine. Cruz has watched them long enough to recognize those patterns from minimal information. It's not magic. It's observation and experience. It's also, Santos added, looking at the latest report, buying us time. Cruz estimates the Japanese will need at least 2 more days to systematically clear the approach trails. That's 2 more days we can use to move the cache, prepare defensive positions, or evacuate the materiel in pieces. Bradley studied the map, his skepticism warring with the practical reality that Cruz's intelligence had been consistently reliable. What's his recommendation? Santos checked the knotted message cord Cruz had sent, a communication method he'd developed because he couldn't write. Each knot pattern meant something different, a spoken language translated into physical form. He says we should leave the cache in place. His exact words, according to the runner, let them come. Trail will tire them more each day, not losing the rice. That's insane, Bradley said flatly. We should evacuate immediately. The Japanese know roughly where the cache is. They're bringing in engineers tomorrow. Cruz's toys might delay them, but they won't stop them. And we extract now while we have time. But Reyes was reading the map more carefully, tracing the trail networks, studying the positions Cruz had marked. He's prepared the entire approach system. Look at this. Multiple trap lines, layered obstacles, escape routes, fallback positions. He's turned the trails into a tactical problem that gets harder the more force the Japanese apply to it. Trails don't win fights, Bradley argued. Soldiers do. And we don't have enough soldiers to hold this position against a determined assault. We might not need to hold it, Reyes countered. We might just need to make taking it more expensive than the Japanese are willing to pay. Cruz seems to think he can do that. And given his track record, I'm inclined to trust him. The debate continued for another hour, and with Bradley advocating for immediate evacuation, and Reyes arguing for trusting Cruz's defensive preparation. Eventually, Reyes made an executive decision. We give Cruz the 24 more hours. If the Japanese break through his trap lines or bring in overwhelming force, we evacuate immediately. But if he can hold them for another day, we've saved the entire cache without firing a shot. It was a gamble based on faith in an illiterate coconut farmer's jungle craft over conventional military wisdom. But in guerrilla warfare, conventional wisdom often got you killed. The message was sent back to Cruz's position. Hold for 24 hours. Report any change in Japanese tactics or force strength. Evacuation team standing by. Cruz's response, delivered by runner at 2300 hours, was characteristically simple. We'll hold. They are coming tomorrow morning. We'll be ready. At 0630 hours, on November 12th, Captain Yamamoto's reinforced column moved toward the trail systems with overwhelming preparation. He'd brought in a specialized engineer section from the 16th Division, 8 men trained in mine and booby trap clearance, equipped with metal detectors, explosive ordnance disposal tools, and marking equipment. The plan was methodical and professional. Engineers would advance in pairs, sweeping trails with metal detectors and visual inspection, marking safe routes with colored tape, documenting trap positions for later analysis. Infantry would follow at safe distances, maintaining security while the engineers did their technical work. It should have rendered Cruz's entire defensive system obsolete. Metal detectors would find wire. Visual inspection would spot tripwire positions. Systematic marking would create safe routes the infantry could use to advance without triggering traps. It would have worked perfectly against a conventional defensive system. But Cruz's system wasn't conventional. The first problem the engineers encountered was that metal detectors were nearly useless in jungle terrain. The forest floor was littered with natural metal sources, iron-rich rocks, decomposing mineral deposits, old colonial-era nails, and horseshoes from pre-war logging operations, even metallic shelled insects that registered on sensitive detection equipment. The second problem was that Cruz had designed most of his tripwires using rattan and plant fiber, not metal. The few metal components he'd incorporated, salvaged wire, tin cans, were positioned as decoys. Molybdenous traps meant to be found and marked, while the real traps remained invisible. The third and most critical problem was that Cruz had spent the entire night before the engineers arrived doing something that would have seemed insane to any military engineer. He'd added more traps to trails the Japanese had already partially cleared. He'd watched from his observation post as the Japanese established their night positions, noted their patrol patterns and security routines, and then, during the brief windows when their attention was focused elsewhere, he'd carefully added new tripwires to sections of trail they considered secured. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. Cruz moved through the darkness, carrying vine sections, trigger mechanisms, and noise-making materials, operating within 50 meters of Japanese security positions. Am's relying entirely on his knowledge of jungle sound patterns and Japanese patrol timing to avoid detection. He triggered no alarms, made no mistakes. By 0500 hours, he'd added 17 new tripwires to sections of trail the Japanese had marked as cleared the previous day. When the engineers began their systematic advance at 0645 hours, they moved with confidence through the sections marked as cleared, and immediately triggered traps that shouldn't have existed. The lead engineer's reaction was captured in his frustrated radio report. Trail marked clear yesterday now shows new trap placements. Enemy infiltrated security perimeter overnight and reset defensive systems. Owls recommend full resweep of all previously cleared sections. Yamamoto's response revealed his growing awareness that he was fighting an unconventional opponent. Proceed with full systematic clearing. Assume all previous work is compromised. Document everything. The re-clearing operation began at 0715 hours and immediately encountered the fundamental problem with Cruz's system. It was too extensive to clear systematically. The engineers found and marked 37 tripwires on the northern approach trail alone. Each one required careful documentation, careful cutting, careful marking. Each one consumed time. Each one required maintaining security, while technical personnel worked exposed on narrow jungle trails. By 10:30 hours, the engineer team had advanced exactly 120 meters, barely a quarter of the distance to the cave system, and had identified so many traps that their documentation process was creating a massive intelligence burden. We're mapping a defensive system that's larger than anything we've encountered in 3 years of jungle warfare, the senior engineer reported to Yamamoto. Estimated wire count exceeds 200 individual traps across all approach trails. At current pace, complete clearing will require 4 to 6 days. 4 to 6 days to reach a cave system that was less than a kilometer away. 4 to 6 days during which the guerrillas could reinforce, evacuate, or prepare counterattacks. 4 to 6 days of exposed troops working in terrain that favored defenders. And Yamamoto faced the reality every military commander eventually confronts when fighting guerrillas on their home terrain. Conventional tactics had conventional timelines, and those timelines often exceeded operational viability. He considered his options. Option 1. Continue systematic clearing. Guaranteed safety for his troops, guaranteed eventual success, but unacceptable timeline, and massive resource consumption. Option 2. Abandon the systematic approach and conduct a rapid assault, accepting casualties from traps as the price of quick success. Faster, but potentially costly in personnel, and guaranteed to create visible casualties that would demoralize other units. Option 3. Call in artillery or air support to simply destroy the entire defensive system along with the cave complex. Effective. Somebody would also destroy the supply cache they were trying to capture, defeating the entire purpose of the operation. Option 4. Withdraw. Report the position as too heavily defended for current force strength. Request battalion-level assault with armor and heavy weapons support. Safe, professional, and a career-ending admission that his reinforced company had been stymied by guerrilla booby traps. At 11:45 hours, Yamamoto chose a fifth option: aggressive probing assault. All engineering teams halt systematic clearing, he ordered. Infantry squads will advance rapidly on all 4 approaches simultaneously, accepting trap casualties as acceptable losses. Speed and aggression will prevent the enemy from adjusting their defenses. We overwhelm the position through momentum, not caution. It was a calculated risk that acknowledged the fundamental problem. Cruz's defensive system was effective precisely because it consumed time, and time was the resource Yamamoto could least afford to lose. The order reached the trail teams at 12:03 hours. Infantry squads moved to the front of columns, engineers moved to security positions, and at 12:15 hours, 4 separate assault forces began rapid advances towards the cave complex. Cruz detected the change immediately. The audio signatures from his Tripwire network shifted from careful, methodical triggering to rapid, aggressive activation. Multiple wires triggering simultaneously. Fast movement despite obvious obstacles. The unmistakable sound of soldiers accepting casualties to maintain momentum. The Japanese had changed tactics from cautious clearing to violent assault, and Cruz had prepared for exactly that. At 12:17 hours, Cruz activated what he privately thought of as his final argument, the trap network he'd built specifically for the scenario where the Japanese abandoned caution and charged his positions. This system was different from his hermit traps. It wasn't designed to slow or frustrate. It was designed to channelize, separate, and destroy unit cohesion. The first Japanese squad to hit the final defense line was Lieutenant Sato's northern team, advancing at near-running speed down the trail they'd cleared and re-cleared twice already. They were moving with weapons at low ready, eyes scanning for threats, accepting that they'd trigger some traps, but gambling that aggressive momentum would carry them through before defensive forces could respond. At 12:19 hours, they triggered the channelization system. Cruz had identified a natural terrain feature on each approach trail, a point where the path narrowed between obstacles, where soldiers would naturally compress their formation to pass through. On the northern trail, this was a gap between two large rocks where only two soldiers could walk abreast. At each of these natural choke points, Cruz had positioned his most carefully engineered trap, a double trigger system that activated based on patrol spacing. The first tripwire was set at the entrance to the choke point, at ankle height. The second was positioned exactly 6 meters later, the standard tactical spacing for Japanese infantry on patrol. When the lead soldier triggered the first wire, nothing happened. The wire simply recorded the trigger without activating any mechanism, and creating a 3-second delay while the system waited for the second trigger. When the second soldier triggered the second wire 6 meters behind the first, both triggers activated simultaneously, releasing a pre-positioned barrier behind the second soldier and ahead of the first soldier. The barriers weren't elaborate. They were simply large, deadfall logs crews had suspended in trees on either side of the trail, counterweighted and held by the tripwire system. When released, they swung down across the trail at chest height from opposite directions, crashing into position with enough force to be clearly audible, but not enough to seriously injure anyone who wasn't directly underneath them. The effect was instantaneous. Sato's 12-man patrol was separated into 3 groups, 2 soldiers in front of the barriers, as 7 soldiers trapped between the 2 barriers in the narrow choke point, and 3 rear security soldiers behind the barriers. Unit cohesion collapsed. The soldiers couldn't see each other. They couldn't maintain mutual support. Their tactical formation had been deliberately fragmented into 3 isolated elements that couldn't effectively communicate or coordinate. Sato's immediate radio call revealed his tactical awareness of the disaster. Formation broken. Units separated by obstacles. Regrouping. But regrouping required time, and time was the one thing Cruz's final defense system was designed to deny. Because while Sato's men worked to clear the barriers and re-establish formation, the soldiers trapped in the choke point between the 2 barriers were discovering the real purpose of the channelization system. Cruz had prepared the ground between the barriers with what farmers called sound tubes, buried bamboo sections that amplified underground noise. Positioned throughout the confined space were 14 such tubes, all connected to a central chamber, where Cruz had placed a colony of tree ants in a sealed container. The final tripwire, triggered when the soldiers began physically moving the barriers, broke the seal on the ant container. The result was chaos. Hundreds of aggressive tree ants, suddenly released from confinement and agitated by the disturbance, swarmed into the bamboo tubes and emerged directly into the confined space, where 7 Japanese soldiers were trapped between barriers they couldn't quickly move. The ants weren't lethal. They weren't even particularly dangerous beyond painful stings. But they were aggressive, numerous, Helen emerging from underground directly underneath the soldiers' feet, creating the visceral panic of a surprise attack from an unexpected direction. The soldiers' response was instinctive. Immediate evacuation from the confined space, weapons temporarily abandoned, discipline temporarily broken by the primal need to escape from a swarm of stinging insects. For exactly 90 seconds, Sato's tactical unit ceased to be a combat formation and became a group of individuals trying to escape insects. When the chaos finally settled at 12:24 hours, Sato's squad had traveled exactly 30 meters past their previous position. But they'd expended enormous energy, lost all tactical momentum, and thoroughly demonstrated that aggressive assault tactics were just as vulnerable to Cruz's defensive system as cautious advance tactics. And the other 3 approach teams encountered similar channelization traps, each adapted to their specific terrain. The eastern team was separated by a sudden rock slide Cruz triggered with a carefully positioned counterweight system. The southern team found themselves entangled in a vine net that dropped from the canopy when they reached the narrows. The western team triggered a trap that released a massive cloud of disturbed moths from a rotted tree hollow. Not dangerous, but visually disorienting and psychologically unsettling. By 12:45 hours, all 4 Japanese assault forces had halted their advances. They'd gained some ground. Collectively, they were now approximately 200 meters closer to the cave complex than they'd been at morning. But they'd completely lost tactical cohesion, exhausted their troops, and then demonstrated that neither caution nor aggression was effective against Cruz's defensive system. Yamamoto's situation report to division headquarters at 13:15 hours was brutally honest. Resistance stronger than expected. Extensive prepared defensive works. Multiple approach routes covered by sophisticated trap networks. Recommend reinforcement with company-level assault force and heavy weapons support. The response from division, received at 14:02 hours, was equally blunt. Reinforcement unavailable. Current operational priorities elsewhere. Complete mission with available forces or withdraw. Yamamoto was being told, in the polite language of military hierarchies, that his operation wasn't important enough to justify additional resources. If he couldn't capture the cache with what he had, division wasn't going to help him. And it was a command decision based on broader strategic priorities. But it left Yamamoto with an impossible tactical problem. How to capture a fortified position he couldn't reach, with forces that couldn't overcome the defenses. At 14:45 hours, he made his final decision. All units withdraw to assembly areas. Prepare for nighttime infiltration operations. We'll bypass the traps after dark and locate the cache through stealth rather than assault. It was a sound tactical pivot. If systematic clearing didn't work and aggressive assault didn't work, perhaps stealth infiltration would succeed where force had failed. But it was also exactly what Cruz had been preparing for since the operation began. Japanese infantry doctrine included extensive training in night operations. Yamamoto's troops were experienced in darkness movement, noise discipline, and in silent infiltration techniques. Their plan for the night assault was professionally conceived. Small 4-man teams would advance using compass bearings rather than trails, bypassing the trail-based defensive system entirely, conducting a grid search for the cave complex using night vision equipment and systematic search patterns. The teams launched their infiltration at 21:30 hours under a moonless sky, moving through the jungle like shadows, maintaining absolute noise discipline, avoiding all established trails. For the first 20 minutes, the infiltration proceeded perfectly. The teams moved through the darkness without triggering any alarms, made steady progress toward the suspected cache location, and maintained radio silence as ordered. Then, at 21:52 hours, the first team discovered that Cruz's defensive system wasn't limited to trails. The tripwire they encountered wasn't positioned on a trail at all. It was strung between trees in apparently random jungle terrain, invisible in the darkness, positioned at exactly the height where a crouching soldier's shoulder would brush against it while navigating through thick vegetation. When the wire was triggered, it released a mechanism Cruz had designed specifically for darkness. A suspended water container made from a sealed bamboo section. The water, approximately 2 liters of it, dumped directly onto the soldier, who triggered the wire from a height of 3 meters. Not enough to injure, barely enough to notice in heavy rain, but devastating in its psychological impact during a covert infiltration operation. And because the soldier's immediate reaction, suppressed but still audible gasp of surprise, involuntary physical flinch, brief moment of disorientation, created enough noise to compromise the team's stealth approach. More critically, The wet soldier now had a thermal signature, different from his teammates. Cooler temperature from evaporating water, which made him visible to Cruz's most unconventional detection method. Cruz couldn't see in the darkness. He didn't have night vision equipment or thermal optics, but he understood the jungle at night, and he'd learned over 34 years that certain jungle creatures reacted predictably to human presence. Flying insects, particularly mosquitoes and moths, were attracted to temperature differentials. Also, what the soldier in a tropical jungle created a detectable swarm of insects seeking the moisture and altered body temperature. Cruz couldn't see the Japanese infiltration teams, but he could hear the sudden increase in insect activity around them, and he could use that audio signature to track their movement through terrain where his tripwires were positioned. At 22:05 hours, he sent a runner to Guerrilla headquarters with a message that should have been impossible. 4 enemy teams moving through jungle off trails, positions marked. The accompanying map showed 4 suspected enemy team locations, none of them on established trails, all of them marked with remarkable accuracy. Lieutenant Santos studied the map with growing amazement. He's tracking them in complete darkness through terrain with no sight lines. How is this possible? The guerrilla scout who'd delivered Cruz's message, a village hunter named Pedro, who'd worked with Cruz before, offered an explanation. Cruz doesn't track like soldiers track. He tracks like jungle tracks. Insects, birds, small animals, they all react to humans moving through their territory. Cruz knows the sounds of normal jungle. Anything else tells him where enemies are. That's not possible, Captain Bradley insisted. You can't navigate by insect noises. You can't track moving soldiers in complete darkness using bird sounds. This is either incredible luck or Cruz has spotters we don't know about. But the map was accurate. When guerrilla scouts moved to verify Cruz's reported positions, and they found Japanese infiltration teams exactly where Cruz had marked them. Teams that should have been invisible in the darkness, detected by methods that conventional military doctrines said were impossible. By 23:30 hours, all 4 Japanese infiltration teams had triggered multiple water traps, lost their stealth advantage, and found themselves being tracked through the darkness by an enemy who seemed to have supernatural detection capabilities. The teams withdrew at 00:15 hours, frustrated and confused, having gained almost no ground despite flawless infiltration technique. Yamamoto's after-action report, filed at 01:45 hours on November 13th, was the admission of a professional soldier facing an unprecedented tactical problem. Night infiltration operations unsuccessful. Enemy appears to have detection capabilities we cannot explain or counter. Trail-based approaches covered by extensive trap networks. Off-trail approaches somehow detected and countered despite absence of visible security forces. Recommend tactical withdrawal and operational reassessment. Division's response arrived at 06:30 hours. Withdrawal approved. Document defensive system for intelligence analysis. Operation terminated. The Japanese had given up, not because they'd been defeated in combat. Not a single shot had been fired from either side. Not because they'd suffered casualties. The worst injuries among Yamamoto's 53 soldiers were insect stings and bruises from triggered traps. They'd given up because Cruz's defensive system had made the operation too expensive in time, too frustrating in execution, and then too unpredictable in outcome to justify continued effort. The cash was saved. 17,000 pounds of critical supplies remained in guerrilla hands. The Bataan guerrilla network could operate for another 4 months on captured Japanese materiel. And it had all been accomplished by one illiterate coconut farmer with vine tripwires, tin cans, and comprehensive understanding of jungle ecology. News of the Abuke defense spread through the guerrilla network within days. The story grew with each retelling. Cruz held off 50 Japanese soldiers for 3 days without firing a shot. He detected night infiltration teams in complete darkness. The Japanese classified his sector as too dangerous to enter. Captain Bradley's operational report, filed November 15, 1944, was more measured but no less remarkable. Private Cruz's defensive preparations around the Abuke cache successfully deterred a reinforced Japanese company-level assault over a 72-hour period. Enemy forces withdrew without achieving operational objectives, despite overwhelming tactical superiority. Cruz's unconventional defensive methods, primarily tripwire-based harassment and psychological disruption, proved more effective than conventional defensive measures would have been given available friendly force strength. Recommend formal recognition and tactical analysis of his methods for potential broader application. The recommendation for formal recognition went nowhere. The guerrilla command structure wasn't set up for formal decorations, and Cruz wouldn't have understood them anyway. But the tactical analysis became required reading for American liaison officers throughout Luzon. More importantly, Cruz's sector became a training ground. Other guerrilla units sent personnel to learn his methods. He taught them, as best he could given his inability to read or write formal instruction, how to read jungle sounds, how to build tripwires from natural materials, how to create defensive systems that consumed enemy time and morale rather than enemy lives. The Japanese, for their part, added Cruz's sector to their list of areas requiring special operational procedures. Intelligence files captured after the war showed detailed maps of the Abuke region marked extensive defensive preparations, approach with caution, recommend alternative routes. But perhaps the most telling recognition came from Cruz's fellow guerrillas. In late November 1944, a Japanese patrol made the mistake of entering Cruz's sector on a routine reconnaissance sweep. They triggered his outer perimeter wires at 1420 hours. Cruz tracked them through his network, documented their composition and movement, and sent runners to headquarters with detailed reports. The guerrilla command responded by dispatching a combat patrol to ambush the Japanese unit. But when they arrived at the coordinates Cruz had provided, they found the Japanese patrol already withdrawing in frustration, having spent 2 hours trying to navigate through Cruz's trap networks without achieving any reconnaissance objectives. The ambush patrol leader's report was succinct. Enemy withdrew before contact, so Cruz's defenses sufficient without our intervention. Lieutenant Santos added a note to the report that captured the new reality. Cruz's sector has become effectively autonomous. His defensive systems provide better security than conventional patrol operations. Recommend minimal interference with his methods. From that point forward, Cruz operated with near-complete independence. He received the materials he requested, mostly scavenged wire, rope, and containers, without question. He filed reports when he deemed them necessary. He defended his sector using methods that made sense to him and confused everyone else, and nobody ever questioned him again. Ramon Delgado Cruz survived the war. He returned to his village in 1946, resumed coconut farming, and lived another 32 years in the same modest existence he'd always known. He never learned to read or write. He never received formal military recognition. He never gave interviews or wrote memoirs because he couldn't conceive of himself as historically significant. But his techniques survived him. The tripwire networks he designed became standard guerrilla doctrine throughout Southeast Asia. American Special Forces studying jungle warfare in the 1960s analyzed Cruz's methods and incorporated them into counterinsurgency training. The principle of using natural materials and environmental awareness to create detection networks influenced defensive doctrine in jungle terrain for decades. Military historians studying the Philippine guerrilla campaign eventually documented Cruz's defense of the Abuque cache as a WWII study in asymmetric warfare. The operation demonstrated that successful defense didn't require technological superiority, numerical advantage, or conventional tactics. It required comprehensive understanding of terrain, enemy psychology, and creative application of available resources. The Japanese after-action reports, discovered in captured archives, revealed something even more remarkable. Yamamoto's unit had requested artillery support to simply destroy Cruz's defensive zone rather than try to penetrate it. Division had denied the request as disproportionate force application against guerrilla harassment. In military terms, Cruz's Vine networks had been evaluated as equivalent to fortified bunkers, requiring heavy weapons to overcome. One Japanese intelligence officer's note, translated years after the war, had captured the fundamental strangeness of fighting Cruz. The defensive systems in the Abuque sector appear designed by someone who understands jungle ecology better than military tactics. Conventional assault doctrine provides no effective counter. Recommend treating the area as naturally hostile terrain rather than enemy-defended position. That assessment, treating Cruz's sector as naturally hostile terrain rather than enemy-defended position, was perhaps the highest compliment an opponent could give. He'd made the jungle itself into a weapon so effective that professional soldiers couldn't distinguish between environmental hazards and deliberate defenses. The 17,000 pounds of captured supplies Cruz defended sustained guerrilla operations in Bataan through the final months of the war, and the ammunition enabled dozens of successful raids. The medical supplies treated hundreds of wounded fighters and civilians. The rice prevented starvation in multiple villages, all of it saved by vine tripwires and tin cans, deployed by a man who couldn't read the intelligence reports his defenders generated or write his own name on the after-action documents. In 1978, 2 years before his death, Cruz was visited by an American military historian researching guerrilla operations in the Pacific Theater. The historian asked him to explain his defensive philosophy. What had made him think his unconventional methods would work against trained Japanese infantry? Cruz's answer, translated from Kapampangan through Tagalog into English, was characteristically simple. I watched the jungle for 30 years before the war. I knew how it worked. The Japanese watched the jungle for 3 years during the war. They knew how to fight in it. But knowing how to fight in a place is not the same as knowing the place itself. The jungle taught me. I just listened. The historian pressed further. How did he develop such complex defensive systems without military training? Coconut farming taught me, Cruz explained. You watch rats try to steal coconuts. You learn about tripwires. You watch monkeys avoid traps. You learn about placement. You watch how weather changes animal behavior. You learn about detection. War just made me use what I already knew in different ways. It was the explanation of a man who'd never considered himself remarkable, who'd simply applied a lifetime of agricultural observation to military problems and been surprised that nobody else had thought to do the same. The historian's final question. Did Cruz believe his methods could have worked anywhere, or were they specific to Philippine jungle terrain? Cruz thought for a long moment before answering. The methods work anywhere. There are patterns to observe, and people who don't observe them. The jungle was my classroom. But every terrain has patterns. Every enemy has habits. Someone who watches long enough will see them. That answer became the epigraph to 3 different military training manuals on guerrilla warfare. Ramon Delgado Cruz died in 1980, still farming coconuts, still living in his village, still unable to read the histories being written about him. He was buried in the small cemetery behind the village church, with a simple marker that listed his name, dates, and the single word guerrillero. In 1985, a group of Filipino veterans and American military historians placed a second marker at the site of the Abuque cache. The inscription read, "Here, in November 1944, PFC Ramon D. Cruz defended vital supplies against superior enemy forces using improvised defenses and comprehensive knowledge of jungle terrain. His techniques influenced guerrilla warfare doctrine throughout Southeast Asia. He never fired a shot in the defense. The enemy never reached the cache. His legend endures." The marker stands today, weathered by tropical rains, overgrown with vines, some of which are rattan, the same species Cruz used for his tripwires. Jungle hunters and farmers who pass the marker sometimes pause and to test the vines, feeling their strength, considering their properties. They're learning to read the jungle, just as Cruz did. And then somewhere in the forest, canopy above, tin cans filled with stones hang from barely visible wires, placed by someone who understood that the most effective weapons aren't always the ones that kill. Sometimes they're the ones that simply make victory too expensive to pursue. His technique was primitive. His legend is permanent.